Hello, everybody. It's Vertical Sandwich. Welcome back to Book Reviews. So, I decided to take a moment to actually started rereading a classic novel. You can see the title up above. And I couldn't wait to review it. I actually thought it was really important to put it in the channel. It's one of those things that, like, there are certain things that aren't gonna, being covered by Hugo Award winners. One of the things I put in here are books that I like. And, well, this does qualify as a book that I like. You can see that this is my old copy of 1984 that somebody asked to borrow and then never returned to me, looked different. I mean, they all look different, right? This one's like a giant eye. It's like half of an eye. So this is the pupil, and this is the white part around it. And then the title, right? Here's the thing. Nobody in the comments has ever asked me, like, hey, Vertical Sandwich, you've done like 80 book reviews. In your opinion, what is the most important or what is the best science fiction book that has ever been written? And if somebody had asked that question, my answer would just have been, well, it's 1984. Like, it's 1984. So, for those of you who don't know, 1984 is a dystopic novel written by George Orwell, published in 1949. So at that point, 1984 was 34 years into the future, 35 years into the future. And the UK had just come out of World War II. There was a lot going on with kind of a relationship with Russia and their kind of actions during and after World War II, and kind of the way the world felt about a lot of things, but specifically the kind of communist/socialist system of the Russians. And Stalin in 1949, Stalin is either about to die or at the end of what he's done. So the world is very familiar with kind of the stories about about the purges of Russia and stuff. And like, you can read Darkness at Noon if you're curious about that stuff at all, because it is terrifying. That being said, there are plenty of documentary things you can read, but Darkness at Noon is a novel that I believe actually the original copy was written originally in a different language, and the original copy was lost during World War II. And so the closest thing to the original copy is the English translation. So the English translation is the original copy of a book that was written in another language. It's very strange. So, but 1984. This is 1984. So, in 1984, the main character, Winston, it is Winston, isn't it? Winston is either his first name or his last name. Lives in London, the largest city in Airstrip 1, and he's pretty convinced that Airstrip 1. He doesn't remember very well his childhood, but he's pretty convinced Airstrip 1 used to be called something different, like the UK, but he's not sure. He thinks London's always been called London. But the reason he doesn't know is because the government is set up of 4 bureaucracies. The 4 ministries. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. And so the way that this works is that the Ministry of essentially of Truth is where he works. And he works rewriting and changing information in archives to back up the changing story of the government. Because, like, when production figures fall lower than they anticipated, or than they estimated, then they go back and they rewrite the estimates so it looks like they actually exceeded their original estimates. And you see this throughout the course of the novel, where things happen and then things change. And then the government says that the thing that happened was what they expected, even though they had promised that wasn't what was going to happen. And and Winston's memory is full of things that are different, that are changed. But the struggle in the novel, I mean, here's the thing, it's really hard when you talk. It's really hard to talk about 1984. Partially because I get emotional. Because it's so good. It's so good and it's so important. Like, It's literally like if you rank all science fiction books that I've read on a scale of 1 to 10, then 1984 is like 735, and the nearest competitor ranks it at like a 12. Like, I know that sounds like it's really nuts. That like there are great and amazing, but this book is a treatise, right? It's a treatise on the way government interacts with people, and it's terrifying. And the thing that's super terrifying about it is Orwell knew what he was doing. Like, Orwell is very deliberate. Orwell is you can just by reading you just go, this is one of the smartest men, like that I would have that like this guy's smarter than anybody I know in my life, unless you work at CERN or something. Like, and he was very careful. I mean, he's very and that's the thing is when you read the book, the details just hit you like hammers. Like he's at one point the main character is talking about the mail, and he's like, nobody uses the mail anymore because everybody knows that they open your mail. It's fine. And he's like, so in those things where you have to send a greeting or whatever, there's just one card that you buy with like a huge list of sayings on it, and you cross out the ones that aren't applicable. And you think about that, and you're like, that's how a totalitarian socialist organization would create greeting cards. Because then they only have to print one, and it's, it works for every occasion. And it's such a bland, horrific way to kind of live your life. And the whole book is filled with that. Like, people are allotted victory gin, and people are given victory cigarettes. And then there's like, and there are screens in their houses that like talk to them and play patriotic music, but also look and listen. And so, you're always watching your own house. Like, people are terrified of talking in their sleep because there's no way you can control that, but the telescreen hears it. And you just go like, this is amazing. Like, it's amazing. And here's the thing, is that had George Orwell just painted you a dystopia and been like, here's my dystopia, how do you like it? This book wouldn't be much, right? But what George Orwell does is takes very relatable characters and puts you right inside of them in this dystopia, and then goes like, what does this do to humans as the human spirit? And like the character Winston, like once he decides he doesn't like the system he lives in, he starts saying things like, because there's a language, right? This is the most famous part about 1984, right? One of the most famous parts, aside from Big Brother is watching you, is that there's a language called Newspeak, which is the party's attempt to change English. And what they've done is they're taking out unnecessary words because they want to create a language in which revolutionary thoughts are impossible within the constraints of their language. And that's the thing people talk about, like, Newspeak is capable of doublethink or whatever, where like peace is war, and that's the most exciting part of the novel. No, the most exciting part of the novel is when a linguist is talking about how Newspeak is the only language whose vocabulary goes down every year because they're taking out words, because if you don't have the words for the thoughts, then your thoughts become inexpressible and revolution becomes impossible. And you just like, it's just that's the kind of thing that when you think it, like, it's staggering. It's staggering. Like, you want to sit down and take a moment and be like, that's a truism. Like, that's a thing that is possible. And then, here's the thing though, Orwell doesn't do that. Orwell makes you live it. Orwell puts you in that world and is just like, have fun empathizing with these characters. And you do. You do empathize with them. They're great characters. They're good characters. There's nothing spectacular about them. They're just normal people. They're just normal people in this world. And but the main character is talking about how once he decides he doesn't like to live in the system, that it's going that he's a dead man, right? That there will be some slip up, And once there's some slip up, they call it thought crime. The crime of thinking about revolution is a thought crime, a crime in thought. And crimes in thought are often given away by face crime, which is, looking at someone with disgust when they're doing something appropriate. Clearly, you're guilty of thought crime. I mean, you can't, like, there is nothing in the words I want to say in the English language are inexpressible for how perfect Orwell's novel is. How perfect his system is to be terrifying and effective. One of the big crises with the main character is that he works in this Ministry of Information, so he's changing information as it goes, the Ministry of Truth, and so he knows the past is different than, on an intellectual level, he knows that the past is probably different in reality than it is what the party says, but he also knows that as a person with no actual proof that he can't, it's just easier to live in a world where the party, he believes you can't change the past, but there's some part of him that's terrified by the fact that he might be wrong. Like, what if you can change the past? And this was a huge thing. This is a huge thing that's often talked about in Stalin's purges, is the fact that they went back and doctored photos and took people out, pretended those people never existed. That's a huge part of kind of 1984. They rewrite books. They do everything. They control every aspect of the culture within the party. And so, like, I mean, man, so we can read some of this. Sorry, we've got to read from 1984 because I forgot to turn the phone off, and I was interrupted by a robot. A robot called. I don't know what it wanted. It was a robot. Okay, so in this scene, he gets asked by his neighbor to help with a clogged drain. A married woman with kids. So he's going over there to do that. Have you got a spanner? Said Winston, fiddling with the nut on the angle joint. A spanner, said Mrs. Parsons, immediately becoming invertebrate. I don't know, I'm sure perhaps the children. There was a trampling of boots and another blast on the comb as the children charged into the living room. They're playing like a comb kazoo. Like, put wax paper over a comb, that thing, right? Then the children charged into the living room. Mrs. Parsons brought the spanner. Winston let out the water and disgustedly removed the clod of human hair that had blocked up the pipe. He cleaned his fingers as best he could in the cold water from the tap and went back into the other room. Up with your hands, yelled a savage voice. A handsome, tough-looking boy of 9 had popped up from behind the table and was menacing him with a toy automatic pistol, while his small sister, about 2 years younger, made the same gesture with a fragment of wood. Both of them were dressed in the blue shorts, gray shirts, and red neckerchiefs, which were the uniform of the spies. Winston raised his hands above his head, but with an uneasy feeling. So vicious was the boy's demeanor that it was not altogether a game. "You're a traitor!" yelled the boy. "You're a thought criminal! You're a Eurasian spy! I'll shoot you! I'll vaporize you! I'll send you to the salt mines!" Suddenly they were both leaping around him, shouting "traitor" and "thought criminal," the little girl imitating her brother in every moment. It was somehow slightly frightening, like the gamboling of tiger cubs, which will soon grow up into man-eaters. There was a sort of calculating ferocity in the boy's eye, a quite evident desire to hit or kick Winston, and a consciousness of being very nearly big enough to do so. It was a good job it was not a real pistol he was holding, Winston thought. Mrs. Parsons' eyes flitted nervously from Winston to the children and back again. In the better light of the living room, he noticed with interest that there actually was dust in the creases of her face. "They do get so noisy," she said. "They're disappointed because they couldn't go to see the hanging. That's what it is. I'm too busy to take them, and Tom won't be back from work in time." "Why can't we go and see the hanging?" roared the boy in his huge voice. "Want to see the hanging! Want to see the hanging!" chanted the little girl, still capering around. Some Eurasian prisoners guilty of war crimes were to be hanged in the park that evening, Winston remembered. This happened about once a month and was a popular spectacle. Children always clamored to be taken to see it. He took his leave of Mrs. Parsons and made for the door, but he had not gone 6 steps down the passage when something hit the back of his neck, an agonizingly painful blow. It was as though a red-hot wire had been jabbed into him. He spun around just in time to see Mrs. Parsons dragging her son back into the doorway while the boy pocketed a catapult. "Goldstein!" bellowed the boy as the door closed on him. But what most struck Winston was the look of helpless fright on the woman's grayish face. But back in the flat, he stepped quickly past the telescreen and sat down at the table again, still rubbing his neck. The music from the telescreen had stopped. Instead, a clipped military voice was reading out, with a sort of brutal relish, a description of the armaments of the new floating fortress which had just been anchored between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. With these children, he thought, that wretched woman must lead a life of terror. Another year, 2 years, and they would be watching her night and day for symptoms of unorthodoxy. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. What was worst of all was that by means of such organizations as the spies, they were systematically turned into ungovernable little savages, and yet this produced in them no tendency whatever to rebel against the discipline of the party. On the contrary, they adored the party, and everything connected with it. The songs, the processions, the banners, the hiking, the drilling with dummy rifles, the yelling of slogans, the worship of Big Brother. It was all a sort of glorious game to them. All their ferocity was turned outwards, against the enemy of the state, against foreigners, traitors, saboteurs, thought criminals. It was almost normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children, and with good reason. For hardly a week passed in which the Times did not carry a paragraph describing how some eavesdropping little sneak child hero, was the phrase generally used, had overheard some compromising remark and denounced his parents to the thought police. That's Orwell's world in 1984. And, yeah, people are afraid of their lovers, people are afraid of their children, people are afraid of the television sets in their house, they can't be alone in their apartments. Winston says it as, the only freedom a man has in the world of the party is a few cubic centimeters inside of their own skull. And that's it. And please read 1984. Like, it is become, it's become fashionable in certain arguments, especially political arguments in the States, to quote 1984 out of context in these kind of weird arguments, like we have some sort, but like, we do not live in 1984, like, at all. And I get that there's a slope, right? But like, this is not a political conversation, it's a book review. Here's the thing. This changes who you are, right? It changes how you think about everything. You might not want that. If you don't want to worry about what your government is doing or what your government could do to you, don't read 1984. But you should read 1984. Everybody should read 1984. It's a masterwork of terror that has kind of minimal terror. It's like an institutional horror novel. Like a horror novel about institutions. I don't really know how to describe this book, but one of the things that I do talk about all the time is this is the standard for science fiction story arc as well. Is that that when somebody in a science fiction novel like does something horrible to a character that I find trite and contrived, what I always think about is how organically and beautifully 1984 destroys people. Like the entire book, the entire society demoralizes and dehumanizes people. And so when somebody gets, in some novel where some person just gets, raped or cut up or mutilated for no reason, I just go like, you cannot possibly, with those trite and contrived circumstances, damage people more than George Orwell's 1984 does. And there are things in here, like there are recurring dreams that kind of lead into the story arc and like inform the character's actions towards a goal, and like those things aren't exactly what like the way that they lead the character toward kind of the inevitable conclusion of the novel is telling, right? And surprising. And so Orwell does that as well. Is that like what what you expect to sit down with in 1984? Is you expect to sit down with this dystopic novel where outside of the main characters escape and eventually get outside of Airstrip 1 and there's just like a normal world out there and they're like, hey, like wow, all that was for that's not 1984. 1984 is not going to let you out of the system. Like it's going to do what it does within the kind of constraints of this horrifically tense-filled, like demoralizing, dehumanizing awfulness. And that's the novel you're going to read. And that's the thing, is that, like, sure, you can write the big time and make everything end happily, like, with no real consequences kind of the whole time, or, artificially conflate kind of, a villain by making him a rapist. Like, you can do those things, but you could also just write 1984. And, like, the fact that somebody, like, if the devil is in the details, George Orwell is certainly in hell, because he is, in fact, the devil. This novel is brilliant. It is brilliant. It's an easy read. I started rereading this, like, 2 days ago. I'm halfway through it. It's impossible to put down. It's paced well. Everything's super understandable. Like, it's just great. It's just everything that a great foundational literary classic needs to be. Right? And, like, that's the thing, is that, like, a foundational literary classic has to be shocking and new and original, but also has to be also has to be, like, a good read. And because, like, Ulysses is a foundational literary classic. It's a horrible read. I love I love what James Joyce did, but, like, and is Ulysses a foundational? Yeah, it is. But, like, you can't make high school students read Ulysses. You can make them read 1984. It's readable. It's super readable. It flies right by. It's an amazing book. I can't tell you. I can't even, like, that's why one of the reasons that I never put a ranking system on here, because somebody was like, what, are you going to rank books 1 to 10? And I was like, no, because of this. Like, what do I do with this? Like, how do you institute a ranking system with books when you have this? It's like I could hold up this and Lolita and The Great Gatsby and just be like, okay, these are the 10s. Nothing else is bigger than a 7. Like, there we go. That's not true. This glib and but 1984 is mind blowing. It is mind blowing, like absolutely mind blowing. It's the little things, like INGSOC, which is like English socialism, is so believable, and like Big Brother as a symbol is super believable, and the slogans are super believable, and the London that he lives in is super believable and terrifying, like absolutely terrifying. And when the main character says, he says, I'm thinking these things, so I'm a dead man. Like I am. They will find me and they're going to shoot me in the back of the head. Because that's what they will vaporize me. And he says, the noble thing for me to do would be to commit suicide. He is like, but there's no guns and there's no poison in this society, like easily accessible. So he's like, now the final enemy is my body because it keeps me alive when I should just die. And you just go like, what is going on? Like, how? Like, I don't understand how Orwell lived in his own head. Like, it's so good. It's so good. Just, like, I can gush about 1984 4 hours. I could literally just pull this up and just, like, flip through until I find something that I, like, orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, they'll exist only in newspeak versions, not merely changed into something different, but actually changed into something contradictory of what they used to be. In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. The revolution will be complete when language is perfect. The revolution will be complete when language is perfect. Please, read this. Just, if you've never listened to me about anything else, I probably said this before, read 1984. It's just the kind of thing where you just, It's like getting hit in the center of the forehead with a hammer every page. That's how good Orwell is at just like running this through your head. So, I mean, I'm going to post a 25-minute review of this book because this book is amazing. Like, this book is unbelievably good. It's so good. And you just reread it. Just read it. If you haven't read it, read it. If you've read it, reread it. It's so dense. It's so well made. It's so meticulous that, like, you'll catch stuff you've never caught before. Like, it's just amazing. Orwell, this is the tragedy of George Orwell is this was the last thing he wrote before, this is the last thing he published before he died. Like, that guy could have had other books. Like, how horrifying an idea is that? Like, what would have come after 1984? How do you top this? Yeah, it's one of the perfect novels. There are, in fact, perfect novels, and this is one of them. So, yeah. 1984. Can't say enough good things about it. Literally can't. It's impossible. It's impossible to say enough good things about 1984. Read 1984. Just read it. Just read it. Just, please. Please. Bye, everybody.